There are two kinds of people who move to the mountains: those looking for peace and those who bring clipboards. Unfortunately, I met the second kind. I thought I was buying a quiet cabin where the only drama would be bears fighting raccoons over trash cans. Instead, I got Karen in a BMW, armed with bylaws, a fake smile, and enough HOA violation notices to start a small bonfire. If you've ever had a neighbor like this, or you just enjoy watching a passive-aggressive war unfold, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. This one gets messy. My mailbox? Offensive. My trees? Too natural. My lawn chair? Aesthetic terrorism. And while I was busy trying to meet her impossible standards, she was planning something bigger, something personal. So, yeah, when people ask why I installed motion sensors, alarms, and a few traps, I just smile. This isn't just a story about a cabin, it's a warning. Life was perfect for exactly 21 days. I had bought my dream cabin in Pine Ridge Estates for $320,000, set up my cybersecurity consulting business in the spare bedroom, and was finally living the remote work fantasy that everyone talks about but few people actually achieve. The morning coffee tasted better, the air was cleaner, and I actually looked forward to logging off work each day instead of dreading the commute home. I should have known it was too good to last, but I was still naive enough to believe that reasonable people could coexist without manufactured drama. The first sign of trouble came on a Tuesday morning when I noticed someone taking pictures of my property from the road. At first, I assumed it was a real estate photographer working for one of the neighboring properties, but something about the systematic way the woman documented every angle of my cabin made me uneasy. She spent almost an hour cataloging my mailbox, my landscaping, even the angle of my satellite dish. When she finally got back in her white BMW SUV and drove away, I had the distinct feeling that I had just been evaluated by someone who was very good at finding problems where none had existed before. Linda Brewster returned the next day, and this time she knocked on my door with the confidence of someone who had never been told no. She stepped out of that same BMW wearing what looked like a business suit from the clearance rack, but covered in enough jewelry to fund a small startup. Her bleached blonde bob was perfectly styled in that aggressively suburban way, and she wore sunglasses that probably cost more than most people's rent. Before I could even say hello, she launched into what she called a business proposition with the enthusiasm of someone selling swampland to tourists. "Mr. Morrison," she said, consulting a clipboard like she was conducting official business, "I'm Linda Brewster, president of the Pine Ridge Estates Homeowners Association. Given the current market conditions and the challenges of maintaining a property this remote, I'm prepared to offer you $95,000 cash with a close in 48 hours. The way she presented it, like she was handing me a winning lottery ticket, would have been funny if it wasn't so insulting. This woman was offering me less than 30% of what I had just paid, and she was acting like she was doing me a favor by even making the offer. I managed to keep my voice level when I declined, but Linda's reaction told me everything I needed to know about what kind of person I was dealing with. The friendly mask slipped just enough to reveal something cold and calculating underneath, and she immediately pulled out her phone to resume taking pictures of my property. "Property values can be unpredictable, Mr. Morrison," she said, snapping photos of perfectly normal things like they were evidence of crime, especially for owners who aren't cooperative with community standards. The threat was subtle but unmistakable, and I realized that Linda Brewster wasn't just some overzealous HOA president. She was someone who had turned property acquisition into a predatory art form. When I firmly repeated that I wasn't interested in selling, Linda handed me her business card with a smile that would have made a loan shark nervous. "Pine Ridge Estates has very specific standards, Mr. Morrison. I do hope you'll be able to meet them." She walked back to her BMW with the casual confidence of someone who had played this game many times before, but before driving away she called out what sounded like a friendly goodbye, but felt like a declaration of war. "Welcome to the neighborhood. I'm sure we'll be seeing a lot of each other." That evening, I did what any cybersecurity professional would do when faced with a potential threat. I researched Linda Brewster thoroughly. What I found made my blood run cold and explained the predatory confidence I had witnessed. Over the past 3 years, 5 families in Pine Ridge Estates had sold their homes to Linda or her associates for significantly below market value, and each sale had been preceded by months of systematic harassment disguised as HOA. The online reviews were sparse but terrifying. "Linda Brewster destroyed our family's dream home with 1,000 paper cuts. And run as fast as you can." I should have listened to that last piece of advice, but I'm stubborn, and I genuinely believed that reasonable documentation and legal compliance could protect me from an unreasonable person. The next morning, I woke up to find a bright yellow envelope taped to my front door, and I knew immediately that my peaceful mountain retreat was about to become a battlefield. Inside was my first HOA violation notice, citing my mailbox for being 2 inches above regulation height and my landscaping for showing signs of neglect. The fine was $250, payable within 10 days for problems that had somehow appeared overnight in a property that had been perfectly compliant the day before. As I stood in my driveway looking at a mailbox that was identical to every other mailbox in the neighborhood, I realized that Linda Brewster hadn't just threatened me, she had fired the first shot in what was going to be a very long and very expensive war. The violations arrived like an avalanche after that first notice, each one more ridiculous than the last. Within 2 weeks, I had received citations for grass that was excessively green for the season, paint that showed weather-worn appearance, and, my personal favorite, non-compliance with community aesthetic standards due to visible outdoor equipment. The outdoor equipment in question was a perfectly normal patio chair that I had been using to enjoy my morning coffee, which, according to Linda's newly updated HOA bylaws, was now considered recreational debris that detracts from neighborhood cohesion. Each violation came with a fine between $150 and $300, and the rules seemed to change daily based on whatever Linda decided was problematic about my property. I tried to be reasonable at first, measuring my mailbox to confirm it was exactly the same height as my neighbor's, researching paint colors to prove my cabin's stain was actually newer than most properties in the development, even hiring a landscaping service to address Linda's complaints about natural undergrowth management. But every time I fixed something, 2 new violations would appear, like playing whack-a-mole with a vengeful bureaucrat who had unlimited time and an apparent personal vendetta against my existence. The financial pressure was crushing, but the psychological warfare was worse. I would come home from grocery shopping to find Linda photographing my property, taking notes in an official-looking notebook, while making exaggerated gestures toward my cabin, like she was conducting a crime scene investigation. When I confronted her about trespassing, she claimed she was within her rights as HOA president to assess compliance with community standards, always careful to stay just inside the legal gray areas that made formal complaints impossible. The woman had clearly done this before, and she knew exactly how far she could push without crossing into obviously criminal territory. After 6 weeks of systematic harassment, I was beginning to understand why Linda's previous victims had eventually given up and sold their homes. The constant stress of wondering what new violation would arrive each day, combined with the mounting financial pressure of fines that seemed designed to be impossible to avoid, was wearing me down in ways I hadn't expected. I found myself second-guessing every decision about my property, walking around my own home looking for potential problems before Linda could find them first. The mountain retreat that was supposed to reduce my stress had become a source of constant anxiety, and I was starting to wonder if maybe Linda's insulting offer was actually the most reasonable way out of an impossible situation. That's when my neighbor Ernest Hawkins knocked on my door one evening, and I got my first real insight into what I was actually fighting. Ernest was 71 years old, a retired mechanic who had lived in Pine Ridge Estates for 15 years, and he had been watching Linda's operation evolve from the beginning. But what surprised me was that he approached the conversation with the wariness of someone who wasn't sure if I could be trusted, looking around nervously before settling into one of my allegedly non-compliant patio chairs. "Son," he said quietly, "I need to know if you're really planning to fight this woman, because if you're just going to fold like the others, I don't want to waste my time or put myself at risk." Ernest's caution made sense once he explained what he had witnessed over the years. Linda Brewster wasn't just some power-hungry HOA president. She was running a sophisticated real estate acquisition business that relied on systematic intimidation and legal harassment to force property owners into selling below market value. The Martinez family fought her for 8 months, Ernest told me, keeping his voice low like he was sharing state secrets. Spent $12,000 on lawyers and improvements, but Linda just kept finding new problems. She has relationships with contractors who provide inflated repair estimates, lawyers who specialize in HOA enforcement, and she's very good at making people feel like they're fighting an unwinnable battle. The scope of Linda's operation was staggering, but Ernest's willingness to share information gave me hope that I wasn't as isolated as I had begun to feel. According to him, Linda had forced out 5 families in 3 years, using variations of the same playbook, always staying just inside legal boundaries while making her targets' lives miserable enough that selling seemed like the only rational choice. "She's like a shark," Ernest said. "But sharks are predictable once you understand their hunting patterns. The question is whether you have the resources and the stomach to fight back, because once you start, she's going to escalate until one of you breaks." I spent that night reviewing my financial situation and trying to decide if I was prepared for the kind of prolonged battle that Ernest had described. The constant violations were already costing me serious money, and Linda clearly had access to legal resources that could make things much worse if she decided to escalate beyond HOA harassment. But I also realized that backing down now would just validate Linda's business model and guarantee that she would continue targeting other families who couldn't afford to fight back. As a cybersecurity consultant, I had spent years analyzing systems and finding vulnerabilities, and Linda Brewster's operation was just another system that could be analyzed and potentially exploited. The next morning, I started building my defenses in earnest. I installed a comprehensive security system around my cabin, cameras, motion sensors, smart locks, and monitoring equipment that would document every interaction with Linda and her associates. If she wanted to play games with documentation and evidence, I was going to make sure I had better records than she did. But I also started researching Linda herself, looking for the kind of vulnerabilities that every predator eventually develops when they become overconfident about their own invincibility. Ernest had been right about one thing: sharks are predictable once you understand their patterns, and I was beginning to see opportunities that Linda's previous victims might have missed. My security system alerted me at 2:30 on a Friday afternoon while I was in town, and when I switched to the live camera feed, I couldn't believe what I was seeing. Linda Brewster and 3 associates were making themselves completely at home in my living room, setting up party supplies and carrying in coolers like they were preparing for a weekend celebration. But this wasn't just trespassing. Linda was actually streaming the invasion on social media, giving her followers a tour of what she called her new weekend retreat, while making jokes about people who don't understand business opportunities. The audacity was breathtaking, but what made it worse was the casual way she moved through my space, opening cabinets and commenting on my belongings, like she was conducting a property inspection for potential buyers. For weeks, I had been preparing for exactly this scenario, obsessing over every detail of my defensive system. I had installed a sprinkler system throughout my cabin, loaded with a mixture of water and washable but memorable food coloring, designed to activate in case of unauthorized entry. The system was connected to motion sensors and paired with alarm systems that would create enough noise to alert the entire neighborhood. I had tested every component multiple times, run diagnostics on all the connections, and even practiced the activation sequence from my phone. All I had to do was trigger the system remotely, and Linda's unauthorized party would become a very wet, very colorful, very embarrassing situation that would provide perfect evidence for criminal trespass charges. But when I tried to activate the sprinkler system from the grocery store parking lot, absolutely nothing happened. I tried multiple times, checking my connection, restarting the app, even calling my home network directly, but every attempt failed. I tried the smart locks to trap the intruders inside until police could arrive, but those weren't responding either. My entire smart home network appeared to be compromised, which should have been impossible given the cybersecurity protocols I had implemented. The sinking feeling in my stomach told me that something had gone terribly wrong, but I couldn't understand how my supposedly bulletproof system had been defeated so completely. That's when I noticed Tyler Cross, one of Linda's associates, working on something near my router with what looked like professional equipment, and the horrible truth dawned on me. Linda hadn't just brought random friends for a party. She had brought a tech specialist who had somehow managed to penetrate my network and disable every digital defense I had put in place. The man was clearly experienced, moving through my system with the confidence of someone who had done this kind of work before. I realized that during the past few days, when I had noticed occasional camera glitches and strange ping responses from my router, Tyler had probably been probing my defenses and mapping my network architecture. The realization that I had been completely outmaneuvered was devastating, but it got exponentially worse when Tyler finished whatever he was doing and gave Linda a triumphant thumbs up. Linda walked over to my security panel with a smile that I could see clearly through my own cameras, her expression radiating the kind of satisfaction that comes from a perfectly executed plan. She began manually activating my sprinkler system, but instead of targeting the intruders in my cabin, she redirected the system to spray my neighbor's properties with bright-colored water. The Hendersons' expensive patio furniture got soaked with red dye, the Johnsons' freshly washed car got covered in green water, and poor Ernest Hawkins got caught in a shower of blue-tinted spray while checking his mail. The chaos that followed was immediate and devastating. Car alarms started going off throughout the neighborhood, neighbors began shouting and running for cover, and within minutes, emergency vehicles were responding to what probably looked like a coordinated chemical attack in a quiet residential community. My phone rang nonstop with calls from panicked and angry neighbors while I watched Linda and her crew calmly clean up their party supplies and disappear through my back door, leaving no evidence of their unauthorized entry except for security footage that I couldn't access because my own system was still compromised. The professional way they executed their exit told me this wasn't their first time pulling off this kind of operation. By the time I raced back to my cabin, Sheriff Rebecca Johnson was already there, writing citations while surveying the damage to neighboring properties. The scene was worse than I had imagined, colored water everywhere, angry neighbors demanding explanations, and emergency responders treating the situation like a potential hazmat incident. The humiliation was complete and absolute. Not only had Linda defeated my carefully planned trap, but she had turned it into a weapon that made me look like a dangerous lunatic who attacked innocent people with mysterious chemicals. Sheriff Johnson was sympathetic but firm. Regardless of what had happened inside my cabin, I was responsible for a sprinkler system that had caused thousands of dollars in damage to innocent neighbors' property. "Son," Sheriff Johnson said while handing me a citation for $5,000, "I don't know what kind of vendetta you've got going with Linda Brewster, but this isn't the way to handle it. You're lucky nobody got seriously hurt, because this could have been a lot worse than property damage." She gestured toward the Hendersons' stained deck furniture and the Johnsons' ruined car. "These people are talking about civil lawsuits, and honestly, I can't blame them. Whatever Linda did to provoke this, you've made yourself the villain in this story." The weight of her words hit me like a physical blow, because I realized she was absolutely right. The next morning brought the inevitable escalation that I should have expected. A certified letter from Pine Ridge Estates legal counsel informed me that an emergency HOA board meeting had been called to discuss my pattern of disruptive behavior and threat to community safety. The meeting was scheduled for the following Tuesday, and failure to attend would result in immediate proceedings to revoke my residency privileges. Linda had not only defeated my attempt at retaliation, she had turned it into ammunition for her ultimate goal of forcing me out of my home. The letter included photographs of the damage to neighboring properties, witness statements from affected residents, and a preliminary estimate of repair costs that made my head spin. As I sat on my porch that morning, looking at the stained concrete where my own security system had been used against me, I felt the first real despair since this whole nightmare had begun. The mountain air that had once felt refreshing now seemed heavy with the weight of my failure, and the cabin that was supposed to be my sanctuary felt more like a prison where I was trapped with the consequences of my own miscalculations. For the first time since Linda had knocked on my door with her insulting offer, I seriously considered whether fighting back was worth the cost, or if I was just prolonging an inevitable defeat that was becoming more expensive and humiliating with each passing day. The HOA emergency meeting was scheduled for Tuesday evening, and by Monday afternoon I was sitting in Murphy's Coffee House seriously considering whether to show up at all. The financial calculations were becoming impossible to ignore. Between the HOA fines, property damage claims, legal fees, and ongoing harassment, I was looking at potentially $40,000 in expenses just to stay in a home I had bought 4 months earlier. Linda's original offer of $95,000 was starting to look less like highway robbery and more like a reasonable escape from a situation that was destroying both my finances and my mental health. The stress was affecting my work performance, my sleep, and my ability to enjoy anything about the mountain lifestyle I had thought I wanted. I had my laptop open, researching real estate agents and trying to calculate the devastating financial loss I would take by capitulating to Linda's systematic harassment campaign. The numbers were brutal, no matter how I adjusted them. Even if I could sell quickly, I would lose at least $200,000 between the below-market sale price, the expenses I had already incurred, and the costs associated with finding a new home. But the alternative seemed to be an endless war of attrition against someone who had more experience, better resources, and a proven track record of defeating people exactly like me. The weight of impending defeat was crushing, and I felt more alone than I had since moving to Colorado. That's when a woman approached my table, and something about her presence immediately commanded attention. She looked to be in her early 30s, with dark hair pulled back in a professional ponytail and eyes that seemed to process information faster than most people could absorb it. What struck me immediately was her confidence, not the aggressive, performative confidence that Linda projected like a weapon, but the quiet assurance of someone who was very good at solving complex problems that other people found impossible. Her approach was direct but not threatening, purposeful but not pushy, and something about her demeanor made me pause instead of reflexively gathering my things to leave. "Excuse me," she said, "but are you Cole Morrison, the guy who's been having trouble with Linda Brewster?" My first instinct was immediate suspicion and a desire to end the conversation before it started. After everything that had happened, I wasn't eager to talk to strangers who knew my name and my business, especially not when I was at my lowest point psychologically in considering surrender. But something about this woman's directness made me hesitate, instead of walking away immediately. She pulled out a business card and set it on the table between us with the kind of deliberate, measured gesture that suggested she was used to people being wary of her initial approach, and had developed strategies for earning trust quickly. "Claire Monroe, freelance legal researcher," she said, settling into the seat across from me without waiting for an invitation, which under normal circumstances might have annoyed me significantly. But there was something about her matter-of-fact approach that I found oddly reassuring, like she was treating our conversation as a professional consultation rather than a chance encounter. "I've been tracking Linda Brewster for 8 months, and you're not her first victim. In fact, you're part of a pattern that's much larger and more systematic than you probably realize." She opened a tablet and began scrolling through what looked like extensive legal documents, organized with the precision of someone who made their living analyzing complex cases. "Let me guess about your situation," Claire continued, her voice carrying the confidence of someone who had seen this exact scenario multiple times before. "Linda started with lowball offers on your property, escalated to systematic HOA harassment when you refused to sell, and has now moved into more aggressive territory designed to make your life so miserable that selling seems like the only rational choice left." The accuracy of her summary was unsettling, but also oddly validating, because it was the first time in months that someone had described my situation as part of a recognizable pattern, rather than a series of random, unfortunate events that I had somehow brought upon myself through poor decision-making. What Claire showed me next fundamentally changed my understanding of what I was facing. She had comprehensive documentation on 12 separate cases where Linda had used remarkably similar tactics to acquire properties, significantly below market value, not just in Pine Ridge Estates, but across 3 different counties in Colorado. The pattern was always precisely the same: identify targets who were isolated, financially vulnerable, or unfamiliar with local power structures, create compliance problems that were expensive and time-consuming to resolve, escalate harassment systematically until the targets became emotionally and financially exhausted, then swoop in with generous offers that were actually sophisticated theft disguised as legitimate business transactions. The average victim loses about $120,000 in property value, Claire explained, showing me spreadsheets that documented the financial damage across multiple cases, plus legal fees, improvement costs, and stress expenses that most people never even calculate. Linda Brewster has made approximately $2.3 million over 4 years using this system, and she's gotten very good at staying just inside legal boundaries while destroying people's lives. The scope of the operation was breathtaking, but what impressed me more was the thoroughness and precision of Claire's research. She had financial records, correspondence between Linda and various contractors, even recorded phone conversations that revealed the calculated, predatory nature of what I had been experiencing as random harassment. The question I had to ask was obvious, but Claire's answer revealed something I hadn't expected. "Why are you tracking her?" I asked. "Are you working for law enforcement or representing one of her previous victims?" Claire's expression shifted slightly, and for the first time since she had sat down, she looked less like a professional researcher and more like someone with a very personal stake in the outcome. Her composure remained intact, but I could see something vulnerable beneath the professional exterior, a hint of the emotional investment that was driving her methodical pursuit of Linda Brewster's operation. "My family lost their home to a similar HOA scheme in Nevada 3 years ago," Claire said quietly, her voice carrying a weight that explained the intensity I had sensed from the moment she approached my table. "Different person running it, same playbook, same devastating results. My parents had to declare bankruptcy and move in with my sister because they couldn't recover from the financial and psychological damage. She closed her tablet and looked at me directly, and I could see the kind of determination that comes from personal experience with injustice. I left corporate law and started specializing in HOA abuse cases because I don't want other families to go through what mine did. Linda Brewster is the most sophisticated operator I've encountered, but she's also getting overconfident, which means she's starting to make the kinds of mistakes that can be exploited. Claire and I spent the next 4 days preparing for what we both knew would be Linda's final assault on my property. Based on the patterns Claire had documented from Linda's previous campaigns, we predicted she would escalate to outright occupation of my cabin, probably bringing enough people to make it clear that she considered the property hers by right of conquest. Linda's threatening phone call to Claire had essentially confirmed our theory. She was planning something big for the weekend, and we were going to be ready for her. The preparation was comprehensive but streamlined. Claire handled legal documentation and coordination with law enforcement, while I rebuilt my security system using isolated networks that couldn't be compromised by basic hacking attempts. The new setup included professional cameras with cloud backup, motion sensors that triggered multiple redundant systems, and most importantly, a sprinkler system loaded with harmless but memorable skunk scent that would make the experience unforgettable for anyone who entered my cabin without permission. The goal isn't to hurt anyone, Claire explained. The goal is to create undeniable evidence while making the trespassing so unpleasant that they'll never want to come back. Saturday morning arrived with perfect weather, and Linda's white BMW SUV appeared on my driveway at 11:30, followed by 2 additional vehicles containing what looked like enough people for a significant celebration. I was monitoring everything from Claire's rental car, parked half a mile away with full access to all surveillance systems, while Claire coordinated with Sheriff Johnson to ensure rapid response once Linda's group committed to their criminal trespass. Linda stepped out wearing what could only be described as a victory outfit, a sparkly gold jacket over white pants with enough jewelry to fund a small business, and gestured toward my cabin like she was presenting it to potential investors. "Welcome to our new weekend retreat, everyone," Linda announced loud enough for my microphones to capture clearly. Some people take a while to understand business realities, but eventually everyone comes around to the inevitable. The casual way she referred to my property as ours was infuriating, but it was also perfect evidence of her intent to steal my home. The group of 12 people moved toward my cabin with the confidence of people who believed they had every right to be there, carrying party supplies and enough food and alcohol for a weekend celebration. Linda produced a key from her purse and opened my front door like she owned the place, which triggered our carefully coordinated response immediately. Claire's pre-recorded legal warnings began playing through hidden speakers, explaining in her crisp professional voice that the property was under surveillance, that trespassing was a felony, and that law enforcement had been notified. But instead of leaving, Linda's group seemed to find the warnings entertaining. "Oh, how dramatic," Linda called out, clearly performing for her companions. "Some people think technology makes them smart." That's when I activated the skunk scent sprinkler system, and everything changed in an instant. The reaction was immediate and absolute. People began screaming, gagging, and desperately trying to escape the cabin while the sprinkler system continued soaking them with water that smelled like a family of skunks had declared war on their clothing. Linda herself got caught directly under one of the main sprinkler heads, and watching her gold jacket turn dark with skunk-scented water while she stumbled toward the door was almost worth months of harassment. But the beauty of our trap was that Sheriff Johnson was already pulling into my driveway before Linda's group had finished evacuating, responding to our coordinated call with perfect timing. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. Security footage showed unauthorized entry, audio recordings captured Linda claiming ownership of my property, and 12 people who clearly smelled like they had been wrestling with skunks provided physical proof of their trespassing. Linda tried to claim she had permission to be there, but when Sheriff Johnson asked for documentation, she couldn't produce anything except an illegally made key that constituted evidence of breaking and entering. "This is assault," Linda screamed, her makeup running down her face in muddy streaks. "He attacked us with chemical weapons." But Claire was already approaching, with her briefcase full of legal documentation, and Linda's desperate theatrics were about to become the least of her problems. Ernest Hawkins appeared right on schedule with his own camera equipment, positioned as our official witness, with legal authority to document everything that had happened. Even better, he had been recording Linda's group as they approached my cabin, capturing their casual discussion of plans to celebrate taking possession of my property. The coordination was flawless, The evidence was comprehensive, and for the first time since this nightmare began, I felt like Linda Brewster had finally made the mistake that would destroy her entire operation. Linda's desperation was obvious as Sheriff Johnson began explaining her rights, but she wasn't ready to surrender without one final attempt to flip the narrative. "Officer," she said, trying to summon her usual authoritative tone despite reeking of skunk and dripping with colored water, "this man has assaulted me and my guests with chemical weapons. I demand that you arrest him for reckless endangerment and intentional harm." She pointed at me with a trembling finger, her elaborate makeup running down her face in muddy streams. "We were conducting an official HOA inspection, and he deliberately triggered some kind of toxic attack system." Sheriff Johnson looked skeptical from the start, especially since she had been expecting our call and was already familiar with Linda's pattern of behavior from previous complaints. But before she could respond, Claire stepped forward with her briefcase and the kind of professional confidence that immediately commanded respect. "Sheriff Johnson, I'm Claire Monroe, legal researcher representing Mr. Morrison. I have comprehensive documentation proving that Linda Brewster has been conducting systematic real estate fraud, targeting multiple residents across 3 counties. She began laying out files with practiced efficiency. "The substance in Mr. Morrison's security system is harmless skunk scent, designed to deter trespassers, and everything that happened here was a legal response to criminal breaking and entering." Claire's evidence was devastating, but what surprised me was how Sheriff Johnson's initial caution transformed into focused attention as she reviewed the documentation. "I've been wondering about some of the patterns we've been seeing," Sheriff Johnson admitted. "Multiple families forced to sell under suspicious circumstances, always involving HOA disputes that seemed excessive even by HOA standards." Claire nodded and pulled out another file. "Linda's operation is sophisticated, but it follows predictable patterns. She targets isolated property owners, manufactures compliance crises, then swoops in with below-market offers that look generous compared to the manufactured problem." That's when Claire played her ace, a series of recorded phone conversations that she had somehow obtained through her investigation. Linda's own voice filled the air, clear and incriminating, as she explained to someone how she had perfected a system for acquiring properties at 70% below market value. "The key is making them think they're fighting an unwinnable battle," Linda's recorded voice explained. "Create enough problems, make compliance expensive enough, and eventually they'll pay you to take their troubles away." The recording was devastating, but Linda still tried to maintain her innocence even as her own words condemned her. "That's taken out of context," Linda protested, but her voice lacked the conviction she had shown earlier. Sheriff Johnson was no longer listening to Linda's explanations. She was reviewing Claire's documentation with the focus of someone who had just found the missing piece of a puzzle she had been working on for months. "Ms. Brewster," Sheriff Johnson said, "you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud, extortion, breaking and entering, and criminal trespass." But as the handcuffs came out, Linda made one last desperate attempt to save herself. "Tell them," Linda screamed at her companions, who were still reeking of skunk and looking increasingly uncomfortable with their situation. "Tell them we had permission to be here. Tell them about the inspection." That's when the real collapse began, as Linda's associates realized they were facing serious criminal charges and began looking for ways to minimize their own legal exposure. Brad Kensington spoke first, his voice shaking as he threw Linda completely under the bus. "Permission? She told us Cole Morrison had agreed to sell and that we were celebrating the deal. She said the security system was broken and the owner wouldn't be back until Monday." The confessions cascaded as each of Linda's associates tried to save themselves by revealing more details about her operation. Melissa Torres admitted that Linda had promised them all shares in the property development profits if they helped with acquisition activities. Tyler Cross, the tech specialist, provided the most damaging testimony by admitting he had disabled my previous security system on Linda's orders and that he had emails and payment records documenting their conspiracy. "I thought we were just helping with HOA inspections," Tyler said miserably. "I didn't know she was planning to use it for breaking and entering." Ernest Hawkins contributed his own surprise evidence. Security footage from his property showing Linda and her associates conducting surveillance on my cabin for weeks, planning their invasion and discussing strategies for breaking stubborn homeowners who think they can fight the system. Ernest had been documenting Linda's activities far longer than any of us realized, providing the timeline that proved everything had been premeditated rather than spontaneous. As Linda was loaded into the patrol car, still smelling of skunk and finally stripped of her artificial authority, she made one final threat that fell completely flat. "This isn't over, Morrison," she called out through the window. "I have lawyers, I have connections, and I will make you pay for this." But Claire was already coordinating with the district attorney's office, and Linda was facing multiple felony charges that would likely result in years in prison and complete financial restitution to her victims. The systematic real estate fraud that had made Linda rich and powerful was about to make her poor and powerless. And for the first time in months, I felt like justice was actually possible. Claire closed her briefcase and walked over to me with the first genuinely relaxed smile I had seen from her. "Well, Mr. Morrison," she said, "I think we can safely say that Linda Brewster's real estate career is officially over." 6 months later, I was refinishing my deck when the final court documents arrived, and reading Linda Brewster's sentencing felt like closing the last chapter of the worst period of my adult life. She had pleaded guilty to 19 felony counts and received 3 years in prison plus 5 years probation, with orders to pay $2.7 million in restitution to her victims. The Pine Ridge Estates HOA had been completely restructured with new leadership, and I had received $47,000 in compensation. But more importantly, Claire's investigation had helped 12 other families recover over $800,000 in stolen equity. The ripple effects were still spreading months later. Linda's downfall had exposed corruption in the county planning office, led to the disbarment of 2 lawyers, and resulted in criminal charges against 6 other people who had been part of her real estate fraud network. Ernest Hawkins had become a local hero and was now consulting with law enforcement to identify similar schemes throughout the region. But the most significant change in my life had nothing to do with money or justice. It was the woman who had extended her stay in Colorado far longer than either of us had originally planned. Claire had been supposed to leave for Oregon 2 months ago to investigate a retirement community fraud case, but she kept finding reasons to delay her departure. She had rented a small apartment in town, officially to handle follow-up cases related to Linda's network, but her legal files had gradually migrated to my guest room, and her morning coffee routine had somehow synchronized with mine. Neither of us had explicitly discussed what was happening, but we had fallen into a comfortable partnership that felt more natural than anything I had experienced in years. The evening Claire finally told me she had to leave for her next case, we were sitting on my newly refinished deck, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of purple and gold. "The Oregon case is going to be complicated," she said quietly, not quite meeting my eyes. "A management company systematically evicting elderly residents to convert their homes into luxury condos. It could take 6 months or more to build a solid case." I nodded, trying to keep my expression neutral despite the disappointment I felt. "Sounds like important work. Those families are lucky to have someone like you fighting for them." Instead of responding immediately, Claire stood up and walked to the deck railing, looking out at the mountains like she was trying to memorize the view. When she finally spoke, her voice was softer than I had ever heard it. "Cole, I've been chasing cases like Linda's for 3 years, never staying anywhere long enough to build real connections. But working with you, being part of a community here, it's reminded me what I'm actually fighting for." She turned to face me, and I could see vulnerability in her expression that she had never shown before. "I don't want to leave, but I also can't abandon the work. I'm not sure how to balance those things." I had been dreading this conversation, but also hoping for it, because it meant we were both feeling the same conflict between duty and desire. "Claire," I said, "what you do matters more than I can express. You saved my home, my sanity, and helped families get justice they never would have found otherwise. I would never ask you to give that up." I paused, looking for the right words to express something I had never said to anyone before. "But I also want you to know that if you ever want a home base, somewhere to come back to between cases, there's room here for a legal researcher and all her files." Claire's smile was different from any I had seen before. Uncertain but hopeful, professional competence mixed with personal vulnerability. The next morning, she loaded her car with the files she needed for Oregon, but left her law books in my guest room and her name on the lease for her apartment in town. It wasn't a traditional arrangement, but nothing about our partnership had been traditional from the beginning. As I watched her rental car disappear down my driveway, I felt optimistic about whatever came next, even if I couldn't predict exactly what that would be. 3 months later, I was working in my home office when motion sensors alerted me to a black SUV parked at the end of my driveway. A woman got out and began photographing my property with the same systematic approach that Linda had used almost a year earlier, and my first instinct was the familiar panic that I thought I had left behind. But then I remembered everything I had learned about fighting predatory schemes, and instead of fear, I felt something closer to anticipation. This time, I was ready, with legal resources, technical expertise, community support, and a partner who specialized in exactly this kind of problem. I walked outside to introduce myself to the photographer, who looked up from her camera with a practiced smile that I now recognized as a warning sign. "Good afternoon," I called out pleasantly. "I'm Cole Morrison, and this is my property. Is there something I can help you with?" The woman approached with the confidence of someone who had never encountered serious resistance. "Sandra Mitchell from Mountain View Properties," she said. "I was just admiring your beautiful cabin. In this market, you might be surprised what a property like this could be worth." I smiled back, thinking about Claire's plane ticket home, my comprehensive security systems, and everything I had learned about fighting people like Sandra Mitchell. "Well, Sandra," I said, pulling out my phone to start recording, "I'm sure you're right about the market, but I'm not interested in selling. However, I am very interested in learning more about Mountain View Properties and exactly how you conduct business in this area." The confusion that crossed Sandra's face told me she was used to easier targets. "In fact," I continued, "why don't you tell me exactly how you found out about my property and what kind of offer you were planning to make? I have a feeling this is going to be a very educational conversation for both of us."
At QA Stories, we don't just tell stories, we let the chaos speak for itself. If this one blew your mind, wait till you see what's next.